They evolved from a noble race of warriors, but have earned a dark and terrible reputation during the past 400 years. Manipulators of governments and massive amounts of money, they can be powerful allies, but fearsome opponents. Described by some as nothing better than bullying, drug trafficking flesh peddlers, they are the organized crime wave of terror from Japan. They are Yakuza.
君の秘密を漏らすな。君の女コロニーは手荒らすな。役は自分には誓うな。金は海に売れること。親子には絶対服従。弁護士や殺には訴えるな。
The 6 sacred oaths that bind together one of the most sinister and vicious crime networks on the planet, the Japanese Yakuza. The ancient Japanese crime syndicate known as the Yakuza has evolved into a global criminal organization that is not only involved in the most evil of crimes, but also operates massive legitimate businesses. Investigators have attempted to penetrate the Yakuza and become lost in a bewildering maze, an underworld where truth and myth flicker in the half-light of traditions born centuries ago, during the age of the samurai. Like many other ethnic crime gangs, the Yakuza can trace its roots back hundreds, maybe thousands of years. Modern records trace their origins back to as early as 1612, when people formed groups known as Kabuki Mono, or the Crazy Ones. These people were originally called Hatamato Yako, literally servants of the shogun. The groups comprised nearly 500,000 samurai that were forced into unemployment in a time of peace during the Tokugawa era, forcing them to become ronin, or masterless samurai. Many had turned into bandits, looting towns and villages as they wandered throughout Japan. Yet these fallen ronin cannot truly be seen as the forebears of the Yakuza. Instead, the Yakuza consider their ancestors to be the Machi-Yako, or servants of the town. These people took up arms and defended the villages from the Hatamato Yako, the shogun's servants. They were simple clerks, shopkeepers, innkeepers, laborers, homeless warriors, and other ronin. Everyone who was part of the Machi-Yako was an adept gambler, which helped them develop a close-knit relationship with each other and their leaders, much like today's Yakuza. The Machi-Yako soon became folk heroes, praised by the townspeople for their actions. Their good deeds have been described as similar to England's Robin Hood, and they too became the subjects of stories and plays. But with that role came power, and eventually power began to corrupt. What was considered a noble endeavor began to feed on profit and greed. Perhaps the best way to describe their role is that the modern movie The Magnificent Seven is the American retelling of the ancient Japanese legend of the Seven Samurai. These were people who could be hired to do the dirty work, tasks considered taboo by the common people or the ruling classes. These Machi-Yako gang members included bakuto, or traditional gamblers. They were first recognized during the 1700s, when the government hired them to gamble with construction and irrigation workers. This was to regain part of the substantial wages the workers received. Still, they remained people who carried with them an aura of care for the common man. It is an image still fostered to this day by the modern Yakuza. Former legislator and professor at law Terry Geiger says that even today, the Yakuza sees itself in the role of outlaw heroes of the Japanese people.
They seem to be able to tell themselves that they are sort of outcasts, but they're good outcasts. They're the nice outlaws who don't take from the little guys. And in a lot of ways, it's been a great scheme for theirs. It's very safe in Japan, very, very safe. One of the reasons it's safe is that no petty criminal would be game to operate on Yakuza territory and do things like beat up tourists. That's bad for the image of the local gang, and they will be very severely dealt with if they do it.
It was in the 20th century that the Yakuza began to grow in power and influence. In Japan, they became politically active, with some of their operations receiving official sanction. Various Japanese governments even used the Yakuza as an unofficial police force. Dr. Joseph Siracusa is a lecturer in crime and punishment. He makes a chilling comparison when exploring the roots of the modern Yakuza.
Well, they are the Cosa Nostra, the Mafia of Japan. I mean, they've been around for 300 years. But when the Japanese were let off the hook in the early 1950s, the Yakuza had an opportunity to become legitimate, and some of them did. I think at one stage, the Yakuza had more members in their gangs than there were members of the Japanese police force.
By now, a clear-cut gang structure had emerged. At the top of the tree sits the Oyabun, or father. Below him is a Saiko-komon, or advisor. He, in turn, has a staff of advocates, accountants, and secretaries. Next is a Wakagashira, who is second in authority but not in rank. This is a middleman who makes sure the Oyabun's orders are being carried out. Of higher rank but with less authority is a Shate Gashira, who has underneath him the brothers or senior gang leaders. The structure then fans out with each authority figure controlling minor gangs made up of what they call the children. In turn, each child can control gangs of his own, and so it continues until clans can have many thousands of members in total. As the Japanese economy began to grow and prosper in the 50s and 60s, the Yakuza again grew with it. The ancient rites, rituals, and punishment were refined by wartime brutality into a sadistic art form by the Yakuza, or boryokudan, as the authorities now call them, the violent ones.
What you don't seem to understand, the kind of mistake you made could mean serious trouble for all of us. We have been put into danger. I don't like that. Do you like that, Michihiro? No. Kodoro, do you like to be put in danger? No. Does anyone here disagree? So, that's why you must learn from your mistakes. You will show Giri the strength of your devotion by enduring Yubitsume. This will be a permanent reminder of your error of judgment. You will thank us.
It was the Bakuto, or gamblers, who contributed to Japan's tradition for gambling, as well as Yakuza's traditional finger cutting and the origin of the word Yakuza. The word comes from a hand in a card game called Hanafuda, or flower cards, which is similar to blackjack. 3 cards are dealt per player, and the last digit of the total counts as the number of the hand. A hand of 20, the worst score, gives a score of 0. One such losing combination is 893, or in Japanese, Yakuza, which began to be widely used to denote something useless. This term began to be used about Bakuto, as they were on the whole useless to society. Yubitsume, the custom of finger cutting, was introduced by the Bakuto. The top joint of the little finger is ceremoniously severed, signifying a weakening of the hand, which meant that the gambler could not hold his sword as firmly. Yubitsume was usually performed as an act of apology or giri to the Oyabun. Further infractions would either mean the severing of the next joint or the top section of another finger. It is also used as a lasting punishment just before expulsion. The use of tattoos also came from the criminal aspect of the Bakuto. Criminals were usually tattooed with a black ring around an arm for each offense he had committed. However, the tattoos soon became a test of strength as they were applied by undergoing hundreds of hours for a complete back tattoo. The tattoo also marked a misfit, always unwilling to adapt themselves to society. Asia-Pacific crime reporter, author, and advisor Bob Bottom. It was only a matter of time before the modern Yakuza brazenly emerged as a potent crime force on the world stage.
The Yakuza are so up front, they actually have their offices in the main streets of the cities of Japan, and they have their names on them. They don't hide behind dark alleys like they might in Manhattan or you know, Soho in England or somewhere. They actually have formal offices and declare themselves. They often congregate publicly and the like, and so they're very, very upfront. So if they did decide to really expand, and they number in the, you know, sometimes up to 40,000 in one Yakuza syndicate, one would wonder what would happen.
The Yakuza in Japan run their own newspapers, the Yamaguchi-gumi newspaper. They have their name and their badge. They all have little badges on the front of their headquarters. Their gang members wear badges to openly proclaim who they are. And they try and portray themselves as the fine old carriers of the samurai tradition. In the recent earthquakes, for example, one of the Yakuza gang leaders gained a lot of fame by being the first on the scene with refugee relief, with food, with aid, days ahead of the Japanese government. This is the image they love to show themselves as, the fine old samurai warriors making their way against the world.
By the 1960s, the Yakuza had an estimated 184,000 members. Bloody and violent gang wars on the streets of Japanese cities became a fact of life, and weaknesses in laws actually assisted the Yakuza.
Yeah, one of the interesting things about the post-war Japan is there were no crimes up until recent times against money laundering. So they were able to take their illicit profits from other things and then just launder them legally in the Japanese banks and securities and exchanges and things like that. And as I say, there were no laws against that. So in a sense, they were tolerated. And the gangs only became ugly when they started getting bigger and they started to have gang wars among themselves. That's when the Japanese public probably had to back off and the police had to do more and the government had to do more. But by now, their tentacles are everywhere. It's like a generation of the mob in the United States who've gone legitimate, you know. The money is all out there in the corporate world. There's nothing you can do about it.
Being assisted in their crimes or not, it was not long before the crime bosses realized gang infighting was bad for business. And for Japan, business was booming. As Japan's economic miracle rolled on, the Yakuza rode a wave of wealth into the playgrounds of the Pacific. Cashing in on cashed-up Japanese, they hit the tourist trail to Hawaii and other vacation isles. A new gang structure evolved, adapting to the rich new world of the Pacific Rim. The fertile fields of commerce and trade became hunting grounds for Yakuza developers and tour operators. The method was coldly efficient. Yakuza enforcers would identify businesses likely to be frequented by Japanese tourists. Once a business had been identified, they would approach the owner and at first offer a simple business deal. The offer would be that in return for directing large groups of tourists exclusively to that business, the gang would be paid a percentage. If the business operator refused, things would quickly turn nasty with threats of violence or the destruction of the business premises. These threats often extended to the family of the business owner. Needless to say, very few people refused. Once the business became almost totally dependent on Yakuza-controlled tourism, it was then only a small step before people found that they no longer owned their own business, and that they were personally owned by the Yakuza.
first thing is that they provoke an interest in the country. They show that interest by moving in, buying housing, buying real estate, and we had a number of very high-profile Yakuza figures, including the deputy head of the Yamaguchi-gumi, the biggest gang, buying a penthouse on the Gold Coast and using it as a holiday resort. Now, when the Yakuza start doing those sorts of things, they don't go on holidays to soak up the sun. They've got their eyes out for business opportunities, and you know what's going to happen next. The triads, the Mafia-type organisations, are mainly involved purely in criminal activities. Drugs, guns, whatever. The Yakuza, though, seem to operate a little differently. They use their criminal activities to give them a competitive edge, you might say, in commerce. Things like tourism, for example. If they are prepared to be quite ruthless about the way they operate their tourism operations, they can get a great edge over normal people in the market and therefore make enormous profits, particularly, for example, in the vertical integration of tourism.
It was only a short step for them to move from doing shady deals to place Japanese tourists in friendly hotels and resorts to actually building them. The gangsters were now becoming developers, but as always, they had a very nasty edge on their competitors.
A lot of the Japanese bubble was based on real estate, where real estate values rose, where there was amalgamation of properties to put up high-rise developments, for example. One of the Yakuza's stock in trade, their most basic activity, was in the amalgamation of real estate, where 30 or 40 small shopkeepers, for example, were bought out to build one high-rise. And when the Yakuza became involved, there was no competitive tendering for their land. They just suddenly discovered that it would be far healthier for them if they sold out early to allow the development to proceed. Now, if you can do that in a hurry, you've got a big commercial edge on any other land developer.
A textbook example of how the Yakuza attempted to infiltrate a foreign country occurred at the very start of the 1980s. The Gold Coast in the Australian state of Queensland had become a major destination for Japanese tourists. And as Gold Coast-based criminal lawyer Chris Neist explains, in with the tourists came the crime gangs.
The 1980s was a real money time on the Gold Coast. The Japanese came here in force, and it was pretty clear, even at the time, that there was a lot of money floating around that was perhaps not entirely legitimate money, and there were certain shadowy figures, Japanese figures who sort of had that kind of aura about them that there was talk about Yakuza and all this sort of stuff, but they seemed to have no visible means of support and a lot of cash money. There were a lot of transactions going through at the time that were of doubtful, shady transactions in real estate and so forth. I recall at one stage being in a civil case and cross-examining a Japanese real estate agent who was resident in Australia and doing business in Australia, and some evidence came out that a client had handed to him a paper bag that had 250,000 Australian dollars in it, and the cross-examination went on, and his evidence was, oh, well, this was, pretty standard practice. There was nothing unusual at all about that, and we went on and on and cross-examined this. And as it came out, he saw him, $50,000 here, $200,000 there, $300,000 in cash on a day-by-day basis. And these were things that were going into Gold Coast property. They were going into Gold Coast units, beachfront units, and this sort of thing. So there was a lot of that kind of activity by people who could be identified with the Japanese crime scene. And there was also a lot of activity in our casinos and so forth. And I think the police in recent times have become very aware of that and have tightened up on the surveillance procedures, etc. But there were people who were ostensibly turning over $100,000, $200,000 a night in our casinos. And so I suspect that a large part of the presence of Japanese crime figures on the Gold Coast during the 80s was all about money laundering and cleaning up a lot of the money that they'd been taking out of crime in Asia.
It was about this time that authorities in the United States and other countries around the Pacific began to become fully aware of the spread of Yakuza power and influence. Two special undercover officers prepared this report for the Los Angeles Police Department. It gives striking detail of the organization of the Yakuza and the boryokudan, their methods of infiltration of legitimate business, and the key to their success in using crime as an edge.
The
boryokudan are much like Japanese corporations. Most groups are highly organized entities with a strong emphasis on family ties, and the Oyeban-Koban relationship serving as a bond which ultimately holds the organization together. Essentially today, Japanese organized crime has evolved into several hundred corporate bands of intellectual and brutally loyal international gangsters. A boryokudan member is aggressive in attitude and not at all like a typical humble Japanese tourist. He swaggers and has an exaggerated bold walk. His facial features are tough or hardened with the so-called black eyes of death. When questioned about his occupation, the response is often reflective of the type of business established or influenced by organized crime, such as bars, coffee houses, restaurants, nightclubs, pachinko parlors, money lending, construction, real estate management, transportation, and trucking. There are also the associates, those who have not gone through the traditional sake initiation ceremony. It's often these associates who run front organizations and overseas operations, making them difficult to detect. These associates contend with ordinary citizens who are willing to deal with the underworld because it feels a financial or civil need that legal financial institutions and law enforcement cannot provide. These associates may be the most serious criminal threat to North America because they maintain a very low profile. They normally have business experience and are without the usual outward signs of boryokudan membership, such as the tattoos, missing fingers, and flamboyant behavior patterns.
The Yakuza may claim a link with history and the noble warrior tradition, but today the reality is far different. Often recruited from street gangs, Yakuza members are now mostly common thugs, trained in strong-arm tactics and shakedown methods. Mark Craig is a former police sergeant and lecturer in intelligence studies and is considered to be an expert on the operation of Asian crime gangs. Craig worked for 3 years in Japan and says a modern Yakuza cannot claim a noble past.
That, in my opinion, would be absolute, hyperbole. That's just myth. Because one has to appreciate that the majority of Yakuza are actually recruited out of the boxing clubs and judo clubs and pool halls of Japan. They are the misguided youth. The Yakuza basically started out in the gambling industry, unemployed, but by and large their activities were not looked upon as criminal. This is back in the Edo period we're talking about now. The days when Admiral Perry sailed into Japan, okay? We're talking history here. This could have really very little to do with what we're seeing with Yakuza activities, certainly in the post-Second World War period, which is when they started to move into sort of the corporate world.
And like any good business, growth is important at home and overseas.
The case with Hawaii is rather unique. That was one of the first major, foreign locations that they established a presence, for the simple reason being they followed the Japanese tourists. They followed the Japanese businessmen, just like they did in Australia in the sort of the mid to the late 1980s. They followed the investment dollar and the real estate development. They gained a very strong position in Hawaii because the law enforcement there were very slow to react. Because again, it's a secret society. And they were very slow to, appreciate the full extent of the problem. And now it's not possible to eradicate them. They're part of the landscape.
But the Yakuza also have competitors. And sometimes they can be right next door.
Now in Tokyo, around the Kabukicho area, which is the entertainment district, which is the stronghold of Yakuza operations in Tokyo, the Chinese have actually beaten them at their own game. They're charging better prices. A contract hit, for example, is running at about $2,700 US, very cheap. They are not afraid of the Japanese, and there have been several cases that I've read of where they've actually robbed these characters, with a weapon in broad daylight, which is just astonishing because this is just unthinkable in Japanese society. And going back to the Chinese again, there was an incident in Yokohama several years ago, where the Chinese looked to extort a particular restaurant. Now, even though Yokohama Chinatown is a Chinese Chinatown, obviously, the Japanese still were collecting money in there, okay? Now, the Chinese moved in. In this particular instance, the Chinese took a cleaver, not unlike this cleaver here, and decapitated a waiter in full view of the entire restaurant as a message that they are the new kind of boys in town.
Even in the underworld, you need a business plan. And the stricter the execution of that plan and the people you involve, the bigger the reward.
The traditional scenario is something like this. Earn your money through criminal activities and then launder it into legitimate activities. For example, the Yakuza in Japan earn around about $3.5 million US per year through the distribution of ice, which is methamphetamine. Now that money has to be laundered somewhere, and if they can get it abroad, which they can through various front companies, they invest in legitimate business. One example comes to mind how they sought to do this, and they engaged an international consultant by the name of Prescott Bush. Now Prescott is the brother of President George Bush. Now he runs an international consultancy, and what they did, through some front companies in Japan, got him to purchase some respectable companies in New York and Texas. Now, he received a $1 million commission for his work. He never knew he was working for the mob, and that's simply how they do business.
Still, we have seen as the 1980s rolled on and the Japanese economic bubble burst, things started to go bad in a big way for the Yakuza gangs. First, a series of violent events turned the Japanese people against those who had been regarded as their protectors. No longer is it considered desirable to have a Yakuza living on your block.
Up until the early 80s, that was the case, and I lived in Japan in the early 80s. One felt safe. Then actually, kind of turf battles erupted, and they became very public, and innocent people were actually shot in the streets. Japan is another country where firearms are a no-no and very hard to get, but the Yakuza don't seem to have any trouble importing them from places like the Philippines and the United States. Because of a number of very public acts, they kind of fell out of favour. And it was around about the early 1990s, 92, that legislation was enacted outlawing, actually, because previously it wasn't a crime to belong to Yamaguchi-gumi or Inagawa Kai or any one of these organisations. So new legislation was enacted, which in effect drove these groups underground. And that changed the whole, I guess, the whole balance and the whole kind of way they interacted with society. They were always something to be feared. Don't misunderstand that, because they are still ruthless. But now they're an unknown quantity because they're underground.
So much out of favor are the Yakuza members now that attempts are often made to disguise once proudly displayed symbols of courage, such as ritual tattoos. Some gangsters have even tried a bizarre form of plastic surgery.
What's emerged in the last 10 years or so is the sort of application of prosthesis. And it is not uncommon for the particular person to have an operation whereby a toe is removed and surgically sewn onto the cut finger. And of course it's always going to look mutilated, but then with subsequent plastic surgery, it's not as easy to discern as may have been in the past.
By the early 1980s, however, one major crime syndicate, the Yamaguchi-gumi, controlled over 2,500 businesses, ranging from loan sharking to pornography and prostitution. While the big money flowed, so did the violence and greed. One of the group's leaders was gunned down at a coffee shop by fellow gang members. The execution-style murder occurred in the city of Kobe. Masura Takumi, the number 2 man of the Yamaguchi-gumi, was enjoying his morning coffee when the killers struck. Kobe in 1985 was also the city where over 1,000 black-suited gangsters gathered for the funeral of their murdered boss. 400 riot police were on hand to watch over proceedings. These gangsters are also members of the Yamaguchi-gumi. Their slain boss was 51-year-old Mashiz Takanaka. It was in an apartment building in nearby Osaka where he was gunned down by a rival gang's hit squad. The police said was led by a Yakuza lieutenant. He was caught, the gunmen weren't. Even as Takanaka's body was taken home, Japanese newspapers reported that the Yamaguchi-gumi and the police were in a race to find the 3 gunmen. Takanaka had led the Yamaguchi-gumi for only a few months. And it was his election that caused a rival faction to split away from the Yamaguchi-gumi. It was that group that killed him. They are the Ichiwa Kai, many thousands strong. Both gangs are Yakuza, and together comprise over 100,000 soldiers. They are best recognized, of course, by the missing little fingers after they have made a mistake and atoned through Yubitsumi. This was not a healthy regime to reign over. Even their former boss of 35 years, Kazuo Toka, although surviving many assassination attempts, finally succumbed to the stress of being oyabun and died of a heart attack. Following power struggles, gang wars, and some success from the Japanese police force, there are about half as many of them as there used to be. The major gangs are kept under constant surveillance these days in a continuing war of nerves. It was a different scene just months before the funeral here in Kobe, when the police and the Yamaguchi-gumi were out in force again. That time was to inaugurate their new leader. Takanaka had won the power struggle to the top. At that time in Japan, the head of organized crime made no effort to hide who he was or what he does. Here is a traditional ceremony, making him the head of a $5.5 billion business. With the drinking of the sake, he assumes a mantle of oyabun, or boss. The Yamaguchi-gumi is headquartered in an office building marked by the gang symbol for all to see. There was no need to hide. The Yamaguchi-gumi is run like any business, has a board of directors who meet regularly, examine their achievements, and make goals. If you're successful, you might even make the members honor roll. But during this era of increasing infighting, the violence didn't end within their own ranks. The Yakuza is always ready to go after anyone who decides not to play by their rules.
Oh yes, they've got absolutely no qualms about taking action against people who offend them. The well-known Japanese film producer, for example, dared to produce a film which showed the Yakuza as criminals and thugs as opposed to the samurai image they like to portray. Well, he had a run-in with 2 people with a samurai sword outside his office and required hundreds of stitches to his face. And this is a world-renowned film producer. They'll do that to him. They're not too worried about little guys.
In the 1990s, the high-flying gangsters were hit hard, not from the efforts of law enforcement, but by bad investments. The Yakuza's close ties to the world of business and commerce nearly ruined them.
When the bubble burst, of course, a lot of the banks had turned a blind eye to who they were lending their money to, and there were a lot of Yakuza, billions in fact, dollars, put out to Yakuza development companies. Non-performing loans were therefore sourced to the Yakuza, and someone trying to go around and get the Yakuza to pay up on a non-performing loan is not the healthiest activity. The vice president of a leading bank in Japan found that out fatally, unfortunately to his demise.
At that time, the government launched a kind of a major crackdown, and probably since then, since the early 1990s, the Yakuza have, well, they've seen better days, and they're not looked upon in the same sort of historic awe as they may have been in the past.
The Yakuza have got to be strangled at birth because their whole objective is to get legitimate. And it's very, very hard in a competitive society, a free enterprise society, to find where this thin line between tough business and criminal activity falls. And the Yakuza will always fall on the wrong side, but they're not that easy to detect in a rugged environment of business competitiveness. If they can get established, they are very, very difficult to counter.
Far from retreating to their Japanese homeland, the gang simply began to reinvent themselves and continue to operate primarily throughout the Asian Pacific Rim and the United States.
The west coast of the United States has traditionally been a home for Asian gangs. Chinese, the triad set up there in the San Francisco region. We've had the Yakuza, we've got the Vietnamese, now being the worst of them apparently in the United States. But the Yakuza have got a foothold in there which has allowed them to get very legitimate businesses. And many of the Yakuza involvements now in the United States are very difficult to counter because they're so intimately tied up with legitimate investment. And that's what they aim to do.
The United States is a very attractive target. I mean, it is the home of most of the money in the world, and almost every organized crime in the world looks at the United States. And the time will come maybe when the Yakuza or others will also have to team up with, say, Islamic militants who want to punish the United States. And people like the Yakuza might make common cause with Islamic militants or terrorists, just for a season in order to get in or to bankroll their organization. So there are numerous opportunities. I'd say that the chances of stamping them out are zero. Anybody who thinks we have done such a thing, of course, doesn't know much history.
Also, there's been a new spirit by the Japanese government to try and wipe them out. Unfortunately, the result of this has been to make them even more vicious, even more criminal. They are now becoming more and more involved in organised paedophilia rings, for example, of buying young Chinese children and shipping them around the world. The big ring was broken up in Italy, of all places, where they found Yakuza involvement in paedophilia.
So at the dawn of the new millennium, organized crime gangs which once claimed direct descent from the noble samurai of Japanese legend have evolved into peddlers of flesh and death. Author and criminologist Dr. Paul Wilson says this new chapter in their history makes them even more dangerous.
They will keep coming. They are not afraid of law enforcement, and they can fall back on hundreds, sometimes thousands of years of history.
Alarmed by the spread of Asian crime gangs, Australian authorities have formed a unique law enforcement unit. The force combines the skills of street police with the mental muscle of lawyers, accountants, and electronics experts. A veteran of 38 years in what he calls the war with organized crime, the general manager of the National Crime Authority is Peter Lamb.
Yes, in each of our investigative teams around the country, we have lawyers, we have accountants, we have analysts, and we have technical experts, a whole range of technical experts, trying to work together in a team model. Now, that's not always been easy. Police traditionally quite aggressive, they're paramilitary. Some of the other disciplines are not that way inclined, but over a period of time we think we've got the formula right, and everything seems to be working quite well. The results reflect that anyway.
For Peter Lamb and law enforcement agencies in many countries, including the United States, the focus has changed. They now know that the new weapons of the organized Asian crime gangs are not swords or knives, but laptop computers.
Yes, particularly in the movement of money. The electronic commerce evolution has provided opportunities for the movement of money around the world at the blink of an eyelid. And indeed, from time to time, there's no trail. So we've had to move with that, or try and move with it. We've had to create laws that were compatible with the current environment. We've had to arrive at mutual assistance arrangements with other countries to permit those type of inquiries to be run on in their countries. Yes, there's a whole range of things that we've got to do, but I think it's fair to say that we're always playing catch-up. We're never really ahead.
So nowadays, a modern sleuth on the trail of the organized Japanese crime gangs and his quarry are often more than likely to be found in front of a computer terminal than walking the back streets of our cities. Still, there will always be a job for the police, whose work takes them into the real underworld of our society. Ordinary citizens, however, now also have the power of computers and the internet. Spreading the word from Japan is a community striving to expel crime syndicates, or boryokudan. This is a Japanese homepage of the NACEB, the National Center for the Elimination of Boryokudan. The anti-boryokudan law came into force in March of 1992. It stipulates that the National Public Safety Commission designate a public corporation in the country designed to prevent unjust acts by boryokudan members and to help the victims of these acts. The Japan Crime Prevention Association was designated as the NACEB. Their main activities are publicity and information like this webpage, training for counselors, research and surveys so that all can see violence reduction trends. It is staffed by lawyers, parole officers, and former police officers, among others. There is even information on what to do if bullied by boryokudan and how to cope with this violence, intimidation, or forcible obstruction of business.
What of the future? Experts say the Yakuza may be badly wounded, but the gang still has its deadly tentacles spread around the globe. Is there hope for victory?
Provided societies are largely the same as they are now, no. The needs of organised crime are so varied these days. They need the capacity to move money, they need the capacity for technology, they need a whole range of things they didn't need before. As those things are brought into the melting pot, it's far more complex to investigate, but at the same time, it is, I suppose, creating work, it is developing expertise, all of which make for a totally different environment than we've seen in the past, and a far more complex one.
The Yakuza and Asian gangs generally are renowned for being very deadly and having no hesitation in killing people to further their aims.
The Yakuza have always been able to adapt to changing times and emerge with new modes of operations, as they have done so many times in the past.
Well, I'm a little cynical. I don't think there's probably any stopping them at all now. They've got too big, they've got too legitimate. But what we have seen is a move to be more vicious with them and to be involved in tackier types of activities. I'd be staggered, for example, if we looked at internet porn and didn't find the Yakuza heavily involved in that. They've traditionally been involved in sex-related industries at the fringes of criminality, prostitution, pornography. Recently we've seen, for example, them involved in paedophilia rings of the supplying of underage children. But I think it would be a very, very safe bet for anyone to say that if there's any internet pornography and similar questionable activities being sourced out of Japan, it's a Yakuza operation.
The Yakuza have had a bad odor among the Japanese public in recent years, particularly the last 10 years when we have all this corporate scandal, etc. And I know Japanese crime enforcement and Interpol and the FBI and others say that the Yakuza are on the retreat in Japan and that in some places eliminated. And there are anecdotal stories about the Yakuza wanting to become legitimate and to repair the damage in their lives and all this. But this is usually mostly nonsense. It's like the FBI saying that they just about have the Mafia out of business because John Gotti's sitting in a prison somewhere. For every John Gotti, there's 100 John Gottis to replace him. For every Yakuza, there are 100 Yakuza to replace them. Because the Yakuza is a very glamorous life, like the Mafia and the rest of it, and it offers to people an opportunity to make a lot of money in a very short period of time. It gives them clout. And as long as Japan and the United States and other places, as long as they worship money, these people will be where money can be worshipped and obtained as quickly as possible. That's why the Mafia will always live, and the Yakuza will always live, and the Triad and the Tong and the rest of it. As long as we worship money, they know where to get it and get it in a hurry.
As long as the Yakuza represents a global menace, the fight will continue. the skirmishes will no longer be fought in back streets, brothels, and drug dens. The new battleground in the war against the Yakuza is now the corporate boardroom and the cyberspace of our increasingly technological world. I'm Robert Stack. Thanks for joining us.